Hey everyone, welcome to Key Concept 5.3. Today we'll be discussing the Civil War and Reconstruction. In our last lecture, we talked about the causes of the Civil War. Now we're going to focus on the Civil War, the strength of the opposing sides, opposition to the war on both sides, who had the advantage, and then obviously why did the North ultimately win. We'll then focus a lot of our attention on Reconstruction, the period of time after the Civil War when the South is brought back into the Union and there is an attempt made to give African Americans full equality under the law, but ultimately that fails. So if you feel like you need to go ahead and pause this, read the key concept. This is directly from the College Board. It's what they want you to know. So feel free to pause it and then come on back and we'll continue the lecture. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is we want to look at the opposing sides. Okay? So when the war starts, when you look at just all of these maps and graphs that I have here for you, it's pretty evident that the North or the Union has the significant advantage. Okay, if you look at just pure population in the top left there, the North has 18.5 million people. The South only has really 5.5 million people because remember, roughly 3.5 to 4 million of those people are slaves. Okay, and obviously the slaves aren't going to be able to fight for the Confederacy. And while you might argue the slaves can help with infrastructure and working in factories and mines and such, it's really not the same advantage, obviously. We look at below that. We see the map of all the railroads. The North has many of the railroads in the country, which means they're going to be able to move troops faster. They're going to be able to move goods a lot faster, and so that's a pretty significant advantage as well. In the top right, we see all the advantages the North has. They have more workers. They have more factories. They have more manufacturing skills. They have more textiles. They can make weapons faster. They can produce iron better. If you look at the North as well, you see they have all the cities, all the massive cities. We're going to find all these things. In the South, when you look at the South as far as urbanization goes, the South really has only a couple really big cities. New Orleans is really the only one. Richmond is kind of big. But really, it's pretty clear the North overwhelmingly appears, has the advantage. Okay? The North also has total control of the Navy, so that's going to be important. We notice that most of the South's bigger cities like Charleston and Norfolk and New Orleans, the biggest city, they're all in the ocean. Okay, and that's because they need those ports to send their cotton and other cash crop goods overseas. So the North's going to have the advantage because the North has the Navy. The North can blockade and basically suffocate the South. Okay. So when you look at this map, when you look at the slide, it appears the North has all the advantages. But it's important for us to remember that just because one side has all the advantages or the apparent advantages, it doesn't mean they're always going to win. I mean, there are cases where the weaker opponent has won. Okay? For instance, you look at the Revolutionary War. The colonies were definitely the weaker opponent. They were outmatched in almost every category to the British, yet the Americans prevailed. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, they outlasted the Soviet Union. On paper, the Soviet Union should have crushed them. Right now, it appears America is withdrawing from Afghanistan. Taliban's still there. It appears that they won. Vietnam, Vietnam clearly was outmatched by the United States, and hey, they won. So just because a side has all the advantages, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win. With that being said, the Union does have some pretty impressive advantages. Now, the South also has some major advantages as well. For instance, the South doesn't have to conquer the North, and that's a huge, huge advantage. The North has to basically send all of their troops and all of their supplies down to the South, and the North has to subjugate the South, and that's always more difficult. The South basically has to defend and survive, okay? Much like how the American colonies had to defend and survive. They didn't have to conquer anything. So that's a significant advantage for the South, okay? Also, when you look at the South, it appears the South had more competent military leaders, okay? Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, to name a few. Early on in the war, the Union typically is summarized by having incompetent generals that don't know what they're doing, while the South seems to have more of those competent generals. Okay, a disadvantage for the South though is that they lack any European allies. Okay, so throughout the war, we're going to see the South trying to gain European recognition and European aid, and so that's going to be something that they're going to be battling throughout the war. Okay. It's also important for us to note that these weren't unified movements. So just because the North and the South are fighting, it doesn't mean that people are in complete agreement. Okay, throughout the North, there is intense opposition to this war. Okay, in fact, Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1864, he privately, conferred to his friends and even to himself that he thought he was going to lose that election. And you see how desperate Lincoln gets in 1864 because he's forced to pick a Democrat to be his vice president. Okay, to basically win over some of the war Democrats, people that supported the fighting. So in the North, there was some intense opposition to this war. The Democrats are still here. I mean, even though the Democratic Party splintered and the Southern Democrats seceded, there are still Democrats in the North, and for the most part, they have intense opposition to this war. And in the election of 1864, the Democrats basically run on the platform of ending the war. Just stopping the bloodshed, ending the war, and trying to have a diplomatic solution to this war. And if that had happened, if the Democrats would have won, who knows what would happen with slavery and what would happen with the South? I mean, if there was a truce that was signed, it would be very interesting how history has changed. In addition to that, the border states, Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland and Delaware, I mean, these are states that are with the Union, yet they're still slave states. And there are people within those states that do have opposition to the Union. Missouri and Kentucky, they basically build up regiments for both sides. There's people in Kentucky that fight for the South, and there's people in Kentucky that fight for the North, and the same for Missouri. So there is some intense opposition from this war. Once the war starts to drag on a little bit, and the North has to draft to fill up their army, there are draft riots. And, the most famous draft riot is the one in New York in 1863. Also, there's many Irish people that are very much against this war. I mean, here they come from, the British Isles, and they step off the boat, and they're going to be drafted to go fight in a war where they have no clue what's going on. I mean, they're going to be against the war. So there's a lot of opposition in the North. It's not like this, yeah, kumbaya, let's go take care of the South. Maybe at the beginning there was a lot of support, but eventually, the North becomes very war weary, and in many respects, the South tries to exploit that. When they invade the North in 1863 and try to provoke a major battle at Gettysburg, one of their agendas is to basically whoop the North at Gettysburg, and then to march on a couple cities and to really kind of get this opposition to the war at such a high level that Lincoln is forced to end the war. So there definitely is opposition to the war in the North. Same holds true for the South. The South has very intense opposition to this war. Okay, I think it goes without saying that African Americans are obviously against the Confederacy. I think that makes me Captain Obvious for saying that. But the South had a lot of trouble with African Americans. African Americans, once they heard that this war was going on, and once they knew a Union army was close, slaves would run away, and their white masters could do nothing to stop them. They would just run away. They would flee to the lines, and that disrupted cotton production. It disrupted building roads and railroads and mining and all that stuff. So the fact that African Americans resisted the war, I mean, that was a huge detriment to the South fighting the war. And also consider this: the fact that the war was going on meant the possibility of rebellions, slave rebellions, was a lot higher. So a lot of states had to keep a lot of their troops at home to protect against these slave rebellions. In addition to that, there are a lot of areas in the South that were against secession. If you look at the map in the top right, when there were votes for secession, you see there are significant areas of the South where secession was very unpopular. Lots of areas where there was poor whites who had no slaves saw no reason to fight for the wealthy planters. And in fact, in Virginia, there was one part of Virginia, the western part of Virginia, that was so against the war that they basically seceded from Virginia and formed the state of West Virginia. Tennessee, look at eastern Tennessee. Eastern Tennessee was intensely unionist, and they were anti-Confederacy. And so throughout the war, the South has to deal with these people that are anti-war. They're anti the Confederacy, and many of those people assist the Union. Many of those people fight for the Union. So it's definitely something important to note that there was resistance to this war throughout the South. And eventually, even the Confederacy has to institute a draft. I mean, think about that. They have to force people to fight for their cause. And whenever you have to force people to fight for the cause, I think that implies that there's some resistance to fighting, correct? So it's important for us to recognize that there is the opposition for both sides. Now, another important thing to understand about the Civil War, obviously, is that slavery unravels. And slaves are freed, and that's obviously an important development in American history. But we also have to recognize that ending slavery was not initially the plan. It becomes the plan. And there's kind of a slow step-by-step process in which slavery starts to unravel during the Civil War. But early on, it's important to note that that wasn't the goal. In fact, early on, when Union generals actually encountered runaway slaves, they oftentimes would return the slaves to the Southern owners. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, why would they do that? Well, there's a law in the books called the Fugitive Slave Act, which says you have to return runaway slaves to their masters. When the Civil War started, it's not like they ripped that up. And so it was very unsettling at first. What is the status of slaves? I mean, Dred Scott decision suggested that slaves are property that can be taken anywhere. Slaves are not freed if they get to a free state. And so initially it's very unclear. But then we start to see a progression. General Butler of the Union, he starts to confiscate slaves and call them contraband, suggesting that they're property of the enemy, and the Union is going to confiscate those slaves. Okay? Then we have things like the Confiscation Act, which gives the military more power to confiscate slaves. We also start to see the unravel of slavery taking place in D.C. Washington, D.C. during the Civil War has an emancipation of slavery, a compensated emancipation of slavery, meaning that people in D.C. that had slaves would basically be paid for their freedom, but it was mandatory. And then obviously we see kind of the Emancipation Proclamation being that really important piece to the freedom of slaves being put forth. And the Emancipation Proclamation is essentially an ultimatum Lincoln puts towards the South. At one point in 1862, Lincoln basically says, if you don't stop fighting, I'm going to free your slaves, and I'm going to put the deadline at January 1st. And all those states still fighting the Union, they have their slaves freed. Now, obviously, it doesn't all happen at once, but as the Union Army conquers those conquered territories, those slaves are freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it's important to note that this was legally questionable. After the Civil War, I'm sure there would have been some lawsuits saying that this executive order was unconstitutional, and it was very unclear, what would happen after the war ended. And that's partially why Lincoln pushed the 13th Amendment so hard, abolishing slavery, because he was unclear about what would happen. Would slavery come back despite the Emancipation Proclamation? But the Emancipation Proclamation was important for a couple reasons. Number one, it shifts the war more to one of a moral crusade about ending this evil in America, one of America's original sin. It basically says, this war is about more than just keeping the Union together. It's about also freeing people from bondage. Okay. In addition to that, the Emancipation Proclamation also, part of it allows for African Americans to join the Union Army. So we have free African Americans in the North, runaway slaves in the South, begin joining the Union Army by the tens of thousands. And by war's end, 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, with 1/3 of them actually dying in that fight to preserve the Union and to end slavery. So that's an important sacrifice for us to remember. Now, I guess the question is, why did the North win? So why did the North win this conflict? I mean, clearly they had the advantages on paper. But like I said, the colonies had all the disadvantages on paper, yet they won. So what happened? Okay? And I think it's interesting because you look at the Revolutionary War, you look at the Civil War, they're very comparable. So why did the colonies win? Why did the Confederacy lose? And I think the biggest reason for the colonies' success in winning in the Revolutionary War compared to the Confederacy is that the Confederacy never had that signature huge victory. Now, they won battles, obviously. They won lots of battles. But they never won that huge turning point victory. They never got that victory. The colonists got that victory. The colonists whooped the British at Saratoga. That was a huge statement put forth by the colonists. The Confederates never had that. Okay? And in fact, when you look at the turning points of this war, the Civil War that is, Battle of Gettysburg. General Lee invades Pennsylvania. He's seeking that big signature victory, and the Union prevails decisively. Vicksburg falls to the Union. That takes away the Mississippi River from the Confederacy. Sherman's March to the Sea guts the Confederacy. So I think that when you look at the major battles that really mattered, the North wins them all. Okay? And the Confederates very much needed the French and the British to jump into this war and to intervene. And they never did, because the South was, the Europeans were in this very awkward situation. They don't want to irritate the North. However, if the Confederates looked like they had a chance to win, they very much might have interjected and sought a mediation to the conflict, but that never happened. Okay, so the North wins because of their overwhelming superiority, and I think the South loses because they don't have that signature victory. They don't get that European intervention, like the colonies did in the Revolutionary War. So once the war is over, Reconstruction has to take place. Okay, now we all know the plan here. We all know what happens to Lincoln. Lincoln dies. Okay, but Lincoln kind of starts off this idea of Reconstruction, and I think for the most part, it appears that Lincoln wants to be not very strict on the Confederacy. He wants the nation to heal. Okay, I think that's where most people thought he was going. We don't have a lot to go on because obviously he was killed, and we never got to see what his plan actually was. Unfortunately for the Republicans, Lincoln's vice president was a Democrat. And so that's obviously going to be an issue for the Republicans. So when President Johnson comes into power, he's going to favor a very lenient policy. And his policy is known as presidential reconstruction. Okay? So basically what he's going to say is this: I'm going to pardon all the Confederates. Okay? If you take an oath of allegiance, you are forgiven. But you have to repudiate secession. You have to admit that secession is basically illegal, and it's not going to happen again. And you also have to refuse to pay Confederate debt. Now, once all this was done, governments could be reformed, state governments, that is, could be reformed, and the South will be welcomed back into the Union. And the South pretty much complied. The South's like, hey, that's a great deal. Let's do this. And all these Southern governments start basically reforming. And, they're ready to assume business as usual. But the Southerners are not going to just let all these freed slaves have equality under the law. And so the Southern states begin to institute what are known as black codes. And basically these black codes are going to grant some freedoms to African Americans. For instance, they're going to recognize marriage. They're going to recognize the limited right to own property and give them limited access to the courts. But the South is very much going to put a lot of restrictions against African Americans. They're not going to let them vote. They're not going to let them testify against a white man. They're not going to let them serve on juries or be part of the state militia. And they're also going to mandate that they essentially have to work on the plantations. There's even laws in the books that say if you don't have a job on a plantation by this stage, we're gonna basically force you to go work on a plantation. It's going to be almost like a secondary form of slavery. Okay? So it's almost like slavery didn't end. While some concessions were given to African Americans, for the most part, the Southerners had no interest in treating them anywhere near being equal to them. And to the radical Republicans, that's going to be something that they're not going to accept. Okay? Now the Republicans do incredibly well in the midterm elections, and they have, really for the first time in American history, an overwhelming majority. A 2/3 majority in the Senate and a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives. And that's incredibly important, guys, because what that means is that the Republicans can basically pass whatever they want, and if the president vetoes it, they can override his veto because they have such an overwhelming majority. So essentially, Andrew Johnson becomes powerless because Congress can essentially pass any law that they want, and Johnson can't do anything about it. Now, one wing of the Republican Party are known as the Radical Republicans, and they are led by Charles Sumner, who's not pictured here, and Thaddeus Stevens, who is pictured here in the top right. And Thaddeus Stevens, his main objective is to destroy the Southern elite. He wants to destroy their power. He considers them traitors. He wants to confiscate their property and distribute that to African Americans. And that brings up a really interesting question. While Reconstruction does bring about political equality for a short time for African Americans through the 14th and 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. What we never do as a nation is that African Americans are never given economic independence. Okay? They are given no land to work. And when you think about it, I guess it would have made sense, right? I mean, here are people that have worked their entire lives, their ancestors have worked their entire lives without any form of compensation whatsoever. And here you have a people who are now free. Where do they go? They have nothing. Thaddeus Stevens argued that for these people to be successful and to truly be free, not only do they need the right to vote, but they need a means, they need a way to live. Okay? But that was something that was just too radical for people to accept. Just stripping people of their property and redistributing that seemed to be very un-American, many people thought. So, Thaddeus Stevens had to accept that, begrudgingly, I suppose. So essentially what the radical Republicans do is they basically stop Andrew Johnson. They basically stop his Reconstruction policies, and they implement a stricter form of Reconstruction. They disband all the southern state governments that were basically founded under Johnson's Reconstruction plan, those 2 years there. And they are basically going to institute, like I said, a much stricter form of Reconstruction. They're also going to push for political equality for African Americans. Okay, so there's some landmark legislation that is passed by the radical Republicans. First of all, they set up the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is basically the first government organization that is meant to actively go out and help people, feed them, clothe them, shelter them, set up schools for them. Okay, it's essentially really the first welfare program in America. I know that today welfare sometimes has a very negative connotation, but I think we miss the fact that a lot of times throughout American history it has really helped people. So the Freedmen's Bureau is set up to help African Americans, and while they do have some success, the Freedmen's Bureau that is, it's such a monumental task that, I mean, there was very little hope for them actually making a huge difference, but they did have some small victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is really the first Civil Rights Act legislation in American history, and actually it's still in the books, and it calls for the full equality. You can't discriminate against people based on their race, and that's still in the books, and that's obviously a very important law. Radical Republicans knew, though, that laws can be repealed, and so they pushed for very important amendments. The 14th Amendment says that people must be treated equally before the law. You cannot discriminate because of race. Okay? So the 14th Amendment basically put that idea out there. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Okay? And the Reconstruction Act split the southern states up into 5 military districts that would supervise the Reconstruction. Okay? So the radical Republicans do institute this plan. And there are some short-term successes to this plan. We do see a lot of really important things going on. Schools are set up for African Americans who have just been freed. And that's so important because we have to remember that here we have people that are ignorant of things like mathematics and literature and geography. You know, slaves weren't allowed to read or write. I mean, it was punishable by death if you were someone that taught slaves to read and to write. So here you have people that are very intelligent, but they're ignorant to all these things, all the science and mathematics and literature. They don't know any of these things. And African Americans, we see during this period, fly to the schools. Not just children, but we see adults, even elderly, are so excited to get in there and learn how to read and do math and all those other important things. Unfortunately, think about it, 4 million people freed. It's such a monumental task. Schools are incredibly underfunded. It's just a very difficult thing to really succeed at, but it's an important step. Okay, so that is obviously a very important success of Reconstruction. Is we do see, the Freedmen's Bureau setting up schools. We also see that once African Americans are allowed to actually be part of the Southern government, a very important step in terms of education is that African American politicians, working together with white politicians in a biracial setting, actually set up the first public school system throughout the South. And so here we see before African Americans were involved in education, the South really had no public education system at all. But once African Americans do get involved in the government, we do see the first public school system get set up. So that's a very important thing. We also see African Americans, once they're freed, they start to set up strikes, demanding better treatment at their jobs. There's sit-ins, there's protests. I mean, they're basically using the rights they now have. African Americans do get elected into office. Here you see a visual of, and this is actually this should just floor you. But throughout American history, these are all the African American senators that we've had in the federal government. We had 2 during Reconstruction, and then the last African Americans served until 1881, and then it was all the way until 1967 when Edward Brooke served in the Senate. And then you see the other senators that served as well. Obviously, one became a president. But yeah, throughout American history, there we see it. We only have, eight African American senators in all of American history. So that's pretty fascinating when you think about it. So anyways, there are some short-term successes for Reconstruction. We do see African Americans taking advantage of their freedom, advocating for their rights, going to government, helping out, setting up schools to reverse the centuries of mistreatment as far as not being educated. So we do see a lot of short-term successes. Unfortunately, there is some intense resistance to Reconstruction. I mean, here we have the Southerners, basically for centuries, like I said, having African Americans being on the bottom of the social ladder. And now you have these Northerners telling them that no, they're not on the bottom anymore. They're equal to you. They have the same rights as you do. They should have the same opportunities as you do. And obviously that's going to be something that they're going to resist. And so one of the main reasons that Reconstruction fails, there's 2 reasons Reconstruction fails. Number 1, the North gets sick of it. Okay, the North gets sick of implementing the policy. Okay, for several reasons. One of those reasons being there was a major economic recession in 1873 that basically shifted people's attention away from it. But also, people just plain old lost interest in the quote-unquote Southern question. But the second reason Reconstruction failed, and maybe the main reason Reconstruction failed, is that white violence in the South was incredibly effective. Terrorism was used, and that is definitely the right word to use. There were terrorist groups that popped up. The most famous one, or infamous one I should say, is the KKK. They popped up and they went around and murdered and pillaged and intimidated not only African Americans, but also any kind of white person in the South that supported Republicans or the Reconstruction efforts. Northerners that came down to the South were known as carpetbaggers because they would basically pack all of their things in a suitcase and come on down to the South. Scallywags were Southerners, were considered traitors that supported the Republicans, and they were also targets of the KKK and other terrorist groups like, for instance, the White Leagues or what have you. Okay, and we know that thousands of African Americans and thousands of whites are killed by these organizations, and they're incredibly effective at basically tearing down Reconstruction. And eventually, as intimidation works, as voter suppression works, the white Democrats are able to come back to power. And they call themselves the Redeemers because they have redeemed the South. They have pushed out the radical Northern Republicans. They've suppressed the African Americans, and they call themselves the Redeemers. So it's disappointing, obviously. We see Reconstruction, this attempted social revolution, fails in America. There was an attempt to bring equality to African Americans, and for a short period of time, for about a decade or so, that was the case. African Americans could vote. African Americans were in office. African Americans had equal protection under the law, but that went away. Obviously, the Redeemers were able to suppress all of those things. And we can look at this and be very pessimistic about the Reconstruction and see it as a dark period of American history, and it was. But I guess taking the silver lining out of this period of American history, while that social revolution failed, we need to understand that it laid the groundwork for a future social revolution that did succeed. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, that laid the groundwork for the 50s and the 60s and the 20th century, where we do see a successful social revolution. We do see a civil rights movement succeed, and we do see African Americans get political equality, get their rights. Okay? Obviously, it doesn't solve the issue of racism, but it does give people equality before the law, and that's obviously an important step to equality in a society. So anyways, that's our lecture for today. Sorry that I ran a little bit long. Please feel free to give me any feedback or ask me any questions through Twitter or my email address. Thank you guys. I hope this helped.